Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the backroom diners and dim social clubs of New York, where conversations were hushed, favors were remembered, and power rarely raised its voice. This is the world of Paul Vario, a man of patience and calculation, where control mattered more than temper, and influence was built quietly, piece by piece. Most people never noticed men like this, not because they were invisible, but because real authority never needed to announce itself. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the calm, deliberate story of Paul Vario. The phone rang at 3 in the morning. In that neighborhood, in that era, a phone call at 3 a.m. meant one of two things. Either someone had died or someone was about to die. Paul Vario picked up the receiver without saying hello. He just listened. On the other end, a voice he recognized immediately spoke 4 words. "We have a problem." Paul hung up without responding, got dressed in the dark so he wouldn't wake his wife, and walked out into the cold Brooklyn night. By sunrise, the problem would be solved. It always was, because Paul Vario didn't just solve problems. He made them disappear as if they'd never existed at all. This is the story of a man who ran one of the most profitable criminal operations in New York history without ever seeking the spotlight. While other mobsters courted publicity and played the role of celebrity gangster, Paul Vario operated in the shadows. He controlled unions, rackets, and entire neighborhoods with a quiet efficiency that made him both respected and feared. He built an empire on discipline, loyalty, and an almost bureaucratic approach to organized crime. And for decades, he got away with it all, living comfortably in a world where most men either ended up dead or in prison. But understanding Paul Vario means going back to the beginning, to the streets that made him, to the world of Italian-American organized crime in New York when it was transforming from street gangs into sophisticated criminal enterprises. Because Paul wasn't born a mob boss. He was born poor into a world where crime was often the only path to prosperity, where the rules of the underworld made more sense than the rules of legitimate society. Paolo Vario, he wouldn't become Paul until later, when he Americanized his name, was born on July 10, 1914, in New York City. His parents were Italian immigrants who'd come to America in the great wave of European immigration at the turn of the 20th century. They settled in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood packed with other Italian families, all struggling to make it in a new country that didn't particularly want them. Young Paolo grew up in a world sharply divided between the legitimate and the criminal. His father worked honest jobs, laboring in construction and factories, breaking his back for wages that barely covered rent and food. But just down the street, other men, Italian men, men from the old country, lived very differently. They wore nice suits. They had money in their pockets. They commanded respect. They didn't break their backs for anyone. These men were part of La Cosa Nostra, the Italian-American mafia that was establishing itself in New York during the 1920s and 1930s. The organization had evolved from the Black Hand extortion gangs and street crews into something more sophisticated. They were organizing, establishing territories, creating the structure that would define American organized crime for the next century. Paolo watched all of this with the eyes of a child who understood that there were 2 Americas. One America promised opportunity and prosperity if you worked hard and played by the rules. But for Italian immigrants in Brooklyn tenements, that America was mostly a lie. The good jobs went to people who spoke English without an accent, who had connections, who looked and acted a certain way. For people like Paolo's family, there was only struggle. The other America, the underground America of organized crime, also had rules, but it rewarded different things. Loyalty instead of education, toughness instead of credentials, the ability to earn money and share it with your superiors instead of meaningless pieces of paper saying you'd graduated from schools you couldn't afford to attend anyway. By his early teens, Paolo had made his choice. He started running errands for neighborhood wise guys. Small stuff at first, delivering messages, keeping watch, doing odd jobs that earned him a few dollars here and there. The money wasn't much, but it was his wit. And more importantly, It connected him to a world that operated by rules he could understand. The neighborhood where Paolo grew up was controlled by the Lucchese crime family, one of the 5 families that dominated New York's underworld. The Lucchese family ran rackets throughout Brooklyn and Manhattan, gambling, loan sharking, labor union corruption, hijacking, anything that made money. They were sophisticated, organized, and ruthless when necessary. Young Paolo proved himself reliable. He didn't talk too much. He showed up when called. He followed instructions exactly. In the criminal world, these qualities were more valuable than ambition or flashiness. The mob needed soldiers who could be trusted, who wouldn't create unnecessary problems, who understood that the organization was more important than any individual. By his late teens, Paolo had become more deeply involved. He wasn't just running errands anymore. He was participating in actual criminal activities. Small-time stuff initially, helping run illegal gambling operations, collecting debts for loan sharks, providing muscle when someone needed to be intimidated. But it was real work, the kind that could get you arrested or killed if you weren't careful. Paolo was careful, very careful. He developed a reputation for being smart, for thinking ahead, for avoiding the kind of reckless behavior that got young criminals caught or killed. While other young guys his age were showing off, getting into unnecessary fights, drawing attention to themselves, Paolo stayed quiet. He observed. He learned. He planned. In the 1930s, as Paolo moved into his 20s, organized crime in New York was going through significant changes. The old mustache Petes, the old country bosses who'd run things according to traditional Sicilian rules, were being pushed aside by younger, more Americanized gangsters. Men like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky were modernizing the mob, making it more businesslike, more efficient, more profitable. The Lucchese family adapted to these changes under the leadership of Tommy Gagliano and later Tommy Lucchese. They emphasized earning money over petty violence, cooperation over constant warfare, infiltrating legitimate businesses over old-style street extortion. And they needed capable people to execute this new approach. Paolo Vario, now going by Paul, having shed some of his more obviously Italian identity, was exactly the kind of person they needed. He wasn't a hothead. He wasn't trying to be a famous gangster. He just wanted to earn, to build something, to rise within the organization through competence and reliability. Paul got made, officially inducted into the Lucchese family, in the late 1930s. The ceremony was traditional. The oath, the pricked finger, the blood on the burning Saint card, the kiss from the boss. In that moment, Paul became a made member of La Cosa Nostra, a soldier in one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. But Paul's ambitions went beyond being a soldier. He watched how the family operated, how money flowed, how power was distributed. He saw that the real money wasn't made on the streets doing robbery and low-level extortion. The real money was in rackets, ongoing criminal enterprises that generated steady income, gambling operations, loan sharking, labor union corruption, hijacking. These were businesses, essentially just illegal ones. Paul started building his own crew within the Lucchese family. He recruited reliable people, guys who were smart and disciplined. He established rackets in Brooklyn and Queens, focusing on areas where he could operate without stepping on other families' territories. He was careful about that. Territorial disputes led to violence, and violence led to law enforcement attention. Better to find areas where you could operate quietly and profitably. One of Paul's early focuses was the garment district. New York's garment industry was huge, employing tens of thousands of people in factories and warehouses across the city. The industry was heavily unionized, and the unions were heavily corrupted by the mob. Paul saw opportunities there, opportunities to extort manufacturers, to control unions, to hijack trucks carrying valuable merchandise. He also got involved in construction, another industry where mob influence was pervasive. Construction companies needed labor peace to complete projects on time and on budget. Paul could provide that peace for a price. He could make sure unions didn't strike. He could make sure materials arrived when they were supposed to. He could solve problems. And construction companies, especially those working on big projects, were willing to pay substantial money for those services. By the 1940s, Paul had risen to the rank of capo, captain, in the Lucchese family. He now controlled his own crew of made members and associates, oversaw multiple rackets, and kicked up substantial money to the family's leadership. He'd proven himself capable of earning and managing criminal enterprises without creating unnecessary drama or drawing unwanted attention. Paul's approach to running his crew was almost businesslike. He set expectations clearly. He demanded discipline. He didn't tolerate drug dealing among his crew members. It was too risky, attracted too much law enforcement attention. He didn't tolerate reckless violence or public displays that might draw media coverage. Everything was to be done quietly, efficiently, with minimal exposure. This approach made Paul's crew one of the most profitable and stable in the Lucchese family. While other capos dealt with internal conflicts, with members getting arrested for stupid mistakes, with operations falling apart due to poor management, Paul's operations ran smoothly. The money flowed consistently. Problems were handled before they became serious. Law enforcement found it difficult to penetrate his organization because everyone understood the value of silence. Paul Vario understood something that many other mobsters never quite grasped, that organized crime was fundamentally a business. A criminal business, yes, but still a business that required management, planning, and discipline. While other gangsters were flashy, spending money ostentatiously and drawing attention to themselves, Paul lived modestly for a man of his position. He had a nice house in a middle-class neighborhood. He dressed well but not extravagantly. He drove decent cars but nothing that screamed wealth. This wasn't because Paul was humble or uninterested in money. He was very interested in money, but he understood that the entire point of organized crime was to make money and keep it, not to make money and end up in prison or dead because you couldn't resist showing off. Every dollar Paul earned, he was careful about how he spent it, how he reported it, how he explained where it came from. By the 1950s, Paul had established himself as one of the most important capos in the Lucchese family. He operated primarily out of Brooklyn, with operations spanning from Red Hook to Canarsie. His crew controlled the cab stand in front of the Euclid Avenue subway station, which served as their headquarters. The cab stand looked like a legitimate business, and it was technically, they actually dispatched cabs. But it also served as the nerve center for Paul's various criminal operations. The cab stand was where Paul held court, where members of his crew would come to report their earnings, to receive instructions, to settle disputes, where business was conducted away from prying eyes and listening devices. It was perfect for Paul's purposes, a legitimate-seeming location that gave him a base of operations and a plausible explanation for why so many people were constantly coming and going. Paul's rackets during this period were diverse. He ran gambling operations, bookmaking, numbers, dice games. These generated steady income with relatively low risk. He ran loan sharking operations, lending money at exorbitant interest rates to people who couldn't get legitimate loans. When borrowers couldn't pay, Paul's collectors would visit them, and the debts would get paid one way or another. He was also deeply involved in labor racketeering. Paul had connections to several unions in the construction and trucking industries. These connections allowed him to extort employers, to demand payoffs in exchange for labor peace, to place associates in union positions where they could skim from pension funds and welfare accounts. Labor racketeering was less risky than traditional street crime and far more profitable. A single construction project could generate tens of thousands of dollars in illegal payoffs. Hijacking was another major source of income for Paul's crew. Trucks carrying valuable merchandise, cigarettes, liquor, electronics, clothing would be targeted. Sometimes the hijackings were violent, with masked men stopping trucks and taking the cargo at gunpoint. More often, they were inside jobs, with truck drivers cooperating in exchange for a cut of the proceeds. The stolen goods would be sold through fences, generating quick cash with the risk spread across multiple participants. Paul was meticulous about managing these operations. He kept mental records of who owed what, who had earned what, who was due what percentage. He rarely wrote anything down. Paper created evidence that could be used against you in court. Instead, he relied on his memory and on the understanding that everyone in his crew knew the rules and would follow them. The rules in Paul's crew were simple and strict. You earned money, you kicked up your share to Paul. Paul kicked up his share to the Lucchese family's administration. Nobody held back. Nobody tried to cheat. If you did, you'd be called in for a meeting, and if you couldn't explain the discrepancy, you'd have a serious problem. Paul didn't tolerate thieves in his crew, which was ironic given that they were all criminals, but there was a logic to it. You could steal from civilians all day long, but you couldn't steal from the family. That was the line. Paul married during this period. His wife Phyllis was from the neighborhood, understood the life, knew what Paul was even if they never discussed it directly. They had children together, started a family. Paul tried to keep that part of his life separate from the criminal part. His kids went to Catholic school. His wife stayed home. From the outside, they looked like a normal Italian-American family. And in some ways they were, except that the father's income came from organized crime rather than a regular job. Paul's relationship with his family was complicated. He loved his wife and children, wanted to provide for them, wanted them to have better lives than he'd had growing up. But he was also emotionally distant, unable or unwilling to share much of himself. The criminal life required a certain hardness, a certain ability to compartmentalize, and that didn't turn off when you walked through your front door at night. His children grew up knowing their father was involved in something, but not exactly what. They knew that certain men treated him with deference and respect. They knew that he always had cash, that money was never really an issue. They knew not to ask too many questions about where he went or what he did. It was understood, unspoken, the way many things in that world were understood without being said. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Paul's power and influence continued to grow. He became one of the Lucchese family's most important earners, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually through his various operations. The family's leadership, particularly boss Tommy Lucchese, valued Paul's reliability and competence. He was the kind of capo they could count on to handle problems, to manage his territory effectively, to avoid creating headaches for the administration. Paul also developed relationships with members of other crime families. In the mob world, while you owed your primary loyalty to your own family, you also needed to work with other families on certain ventures. Hijacking operations might involve people from multiple families. Construction rackets might require cooperation across family lines. Paul was good at these relationships, at navigating the politics without creating conflicts. One relationship that would prove significant was with members of the Colombo crime family. Paul had connections there through various business arrangements, and these connections would later play important roles in his operations. The mob world was like any other business world in that sense. Your network mattered, your relationships mattered, your ability to work with people across organizational lines mattered. In the mid-1960s, Paul's crew took on a young associate who would later become infamous and would, ultimately, contribute to Paul's downfall. His name was Henry Hill. Hill was a kid from the neighborhood, half Irish and half Sicilian, which meant he could never be a made member of the Italian mafia but could work as an associate. Hill was brought into the crew by another member, and Paul took a liking to him. Hill was a good earner. He was involved in various schemes, always looking for opportunities to make money. He was also young and energetic, willing to do the work that needed doing. Paul saw potential in Hill and began giving him more responsibility, bringing him deeper into the crew's operations. Paul couldn't have known it at the time, but Henry Hill would eventually become a federal informant, would testify against Paul and numerous other mobsters, would provide the information that would destroy much of what Paul had built. But that was years away. In the 1960s, Hill was just another associate trying to make his way in the mob world, and Paul was his mentor, his protector within the organization. The relationship between Paul and Henry Hill illustrates something important about Paul's management style. He was willing to bring in talented people and give them opportunities, even if they didn't fit the traditional mold. Hill wasn't Italian enough to be made, but Paul didn't care as long as Hill earned money and followed the rules. Paul was pragmatic in that way. He cared about results more than pedigree. Paul's operations during this period were sophisticated for organized crime. He wasn't just running street-level rackets. He was involved in complex schemes that required planning and coordination. For example, his hijacking operations weren't random. They were based on intelligence about what trucks were carrying valuable cargo, what routes they'd take, when they'd be vulnerable. Someone would have inside information from the trucking company or from a driver. The hijacking would be planned down to the minute. The stolen goods would already have buyers lined up before the truck was even stopped. His labor racketeering operations were similarly sophisticated. Paul would identify construction projects that needed to be completed on tight schedules. He'd approach the contractors, either directly or through intermediaries, and explain that there might be labor problems, strikes, slowdowns, accidents, unless arrangements were made. The contractors, facing enormous financial penalties if projects weren't completed on time, would pay, and Paul would ensure that the unions he controlled didn't cause problems. Everyone got what they wanted, except that the money being paid to Paul was extortion, pure and simple. One of Paul's most profitable ventures involved the famous Lufthansa heist, though this came later. But even in the 1960s, Paul's crew was involved in airport operations. Kennedy Airport was a target-rich environment for criminals. Cargo worth millions passed through every day. Security was often lax. Workers could be bribed or intimidated into providing information or assistance. Paul's crew had people positioned in various airport jobs, providing intelligence about valuable shipments, about security procedures, about opportunities. Paul himself rarely participated directly in the crimes his crew committed. He was the boss, the organizer, the person who approved operations and received his share of the proceeds. This insulated him from prosecution to some degree. If a hijacking went wrong and someone got arrested, they couldn't directly implicate Paul because he hadn't been there. The most they could say was that they worked for him, which wasn't enough for a conviction without more evidence. This organizational distance was deliberate and sophisticated. Paul understood that mob bosses went to prison when prosecutors could connect them directly to specific crimes. So Paul made sure there were layers between himself and the actual criminal acts. He'd give approval for operations without explicitly saying what was being approved. He'd receive money without asking exactly where it came from. If investigators came looking, they'd find it difficult to prove he'd ordered or known about specific crimes. By the late 1960s, Paul Vario was living comfortably. He had money, power, respect within his world. His children were growing up with advantages he'd never had. His position in the Lucchese family seemed secure. He'd avoided the fate that befell so many mobsters. He wasn't dead, wasn't in prison, wasn't on the run. He'd played the game successfully for decades. But the world was changing. Law enforcement was getting more sophisticated. The FBI was beginning to focus seriously on organized crime, using new techniques like wiretaps and electronic surveillance. The old ways of operating, relying on silence and intimidation to prevent witnesses from cooperating, were becoming less effective. Some mobsters, facing long prison sentences, were starting to break the code of omerta and cooperate with authorities. Paul didn't see the storm coming. How could he? He'd been operating successfully for so long, had avoided serious legal trouble, had built an organization that seemed impenetrable. He believed, like many successful criminals, that he was smarter than law enforcement, that his precautions would protect him, that the old rules would continue to apply. The 1970s began with Paul Vario at the height of his power. He was in his mid-50s, a respected capo in the Lucchese family, controlling a crew that was one of the family's most profitable units. His operations spanned multiple boroughs of New York City, and his influence extended into legitimate businesses, labor unions, and political circles. Paul had achieved what many mobsters never managed. He'd survived long enough to enjoy the fruits of his criminal career. The cab stand on Euclid Avenue remained his headquarters, but Paul's empire had expanded far beyond that single location. He had interests in restaurants and bars that served as fronts for criminal activity and money laundering. He had corrupt union officials on his payroll who provided him with advance information about construction projects and labor disputes. He had police officers and other government employees who'd look the other way or provide warnings when investigations were heating up. This network of corruption and influence was Paul's real achievement. Any thug could commit crimes. What separated successful mobsters from the ones who ended up dead or in prison was the ability to build systems, to create structures that generated income reliably while minimizing risk. Paul had built exactly that kind of system. His crew during this period included some characters who would later become well known through books and movies. Besides Henry Hill, there was Jimmy Burke, a brutal Irish-American gangster who couldn't be made because of his ethnicity, but who was one of Paul's top earners. Burke was involved in hijacking, murder, loan sharking, essentially every criminal activity that made money. He was also violent and unpredictable, which made him both useful and dangerous. There was Tommy DeSimone, another young associate who would gain notoriety. DeSimone was a violent, hair-trigger personality who killed with little provocation. He was useful for certain kinds of work, the kind where someone needed to be hurt or killed and you needed someone who wouldn't hesitate. But he was also a liability because his violence was so unpredictable it could draw unwanted attention. Paul managed these volatile personalities through a combination of respect, fear, and financial incentive. Everyone in his crew was making money. That was the glue that held things together. As long as the criminal enterprises were profitable, as long as everyone was getting their share, personal conflicts could be managed. It was when money problems arose, when people felt they were being cheated or weren't earning enough, that things fell apart. Paul's management approach was to be stern but fair. If you earned, you were rewarded. If you caused problems, you were disciplined. If you stole from the crew or violated the rules, you were dealt with harshly. This created a certain stability within his organization. People knew where they stood, knew what was expected, knew the consequences of stepping out of line. During this period, Paul also maintained his relationship with the Lucchese family's administration. The boss during the early 1970s was Carmine Tremonti, though real power was increasingly held by Antonio Corallo, who would later officially become boss. Paul's relationship with these men was respectful and profitable. He kicked up his required tribute, provided support when the administration needed it, and in return was given autonomy to run his crew as he saw fit. This autonomy was important to Paul. He didn't want bosses micromanaging his operations, questioning his decisions, interfering in his rackets. As long as he paid what he owed and didn't create problems, the administration left him alone. It was the ideal arrangement for a capo, freedom to operate with the backing and protection of the larger organization. One of the major operations Paul's crew was involved in during the early 1970s was the systematic exploitation of the Lufthansa Airlines cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport. This wasn't the famous Lufthansa heist that would come later. This was ongoing theft, smaller scale but constant. Workers at the cargo terminal, many of whom were connected to Paul's crew or to other mob-connected individuals, would steal merchandise from shipments. Electronics, jewelry, cash, whatever valuable items passed through the terminal were vulnerable. The stolen goods would be fenced through various channels. Paul had connections to receivers who would buy the merchandise for a fraction of its retail value and then sell it through their own networks. It was a steady income stream, thousands of dollars weekly, generated through relatively low-risk theft. Airport security was lax. The workers doing the actual stealing were low-level employees who could claim they didn't know items were missing. The system worked smoothly for years. Paul's involvement in these airport operations was indirect. He wasn't stealing the merchandise himself, wasn't even at the airport, but he was receiving regular payments from the operation, his cut of the proceeds. The people running the operation on the ground were his associates, working with his approval and under his protection. If there were problems, if someone got caught, Paul would help with legal fees or with taking care of their families while they were in jail. In return, those people maintained their silence about Paul's involvement. This kind of arrangement was typical of how Paul operated. He was several steps removed from the actual crimes, insulated by layers of subordinates. Proving his involvement required witnesses willing to testify, and Paul's reputation for taking care of loyal people and destroying informants made people reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement. But the law enforcement landscape was changing. The FBI had established organized crime task forces dedicated specifically to targeting the mob. They were using sophisticated investigative techniques, wiretaps, surveillance, undercover operations. They were building cases not just against individual criminals for specific crimes, but against entire organizations under RICO, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO was a game changer for prosecuting organized crime. Instead of having to prove that a mob boss personally committed a specific crime, prosecutors could now charge defendants with being part of a criminal enterprise and could use a pattern of racketeering activity as evidence. This meant that even if Paul never personally hijacked a truck or killed anyone, he could still be prosecuted for running an organization that did those things. Paul was aware of these changes, but perhaps didn't fully appreciate their implications. He'd been avoiding prosecution successfully for decades using his traditional methods. He believed that continuing to insulate himself from direct criminal activity, maintaining loyalty through rewards and fear, and corrupting law enforcement where possible would continue to protect him. What Paul didn't know was that Henry Hill, his young protege, was becoming a significant liability. Hill was involved in drug dealing, which Paul had forbidden. Hill was also using drugs himself, becoming increasingly erratic and unreliable. And Hill was participating in activities, including the planning of what would become the Lufthansa heist, that would eventually draw enormous law enforcement attention. The Lufthansa heist occurred on December 11, 1978. It was one of the largest cash robberies in American history at the time. A group of criminals, most of them connected to Paul's crew, stole approximately $6 million in cash and jewelry from the Lufthansa cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport. The heist was planned by Jimmy Burke with assistance from several others, and while Paul wasn't directly involved in the planning or execution, his crew carried it out, and he received a share of the proceeds. The heist was supposed to be a triumph, the kind of score that criminals dream about, but it quickly became a nightmare. The amount of money stolen attracted massive law enforcement attention. The FBI assigned dozens of agents to the investigation. Every member of the crew involved, every associate who might know something, became a target of intense scrutiny. And then the bodies started piling up. Jimmy Burke, paranoid about potential informants and greedy about keeping a larger share of the money, began killing people connected to the heist. Anyone who might talk to the police, anyone who knew too much, anyone who demanded their fair share. Burke had them murdered. The killing spree associated with the Lufthansa heist would eventually claim nearly a dozen lives. Paul watched these developments with growing alarm. The Lufthansa heist had violated one of his cardinal rules: don't draw unnecessary attention. The massive theft, followed by the string of murders, had brought exactly the kind of scrutiny that Paul had spent decades trying to avoid. Federal agents were now looking closely at his entire operation, not just the airport activities. And there was another problem. Henry Hill, who'd been involved in the planning stages of the Lufthansa heist and knew details about Paul's operations, was spiraling out of control. Hill's drug use had become serious. He was dealing drugs in violation of Paul's rules. He was becoming erratic, unreliable, and potentially dangerous as a witness if law enforcement could pressure him into cooperating. Paul had a decision to make. In the mob, when someone became a serious liability, when they knew too much and couldn't be trusted to stay silent, there was usually only one solution. That person would be killed. It was brutal but practical. Dead people couldn't testify. But Paul had a complicated relationship with Henry Hill. He'd mentored Hill, brought him into the crew, treated him almost like a son in some ways. Hill had earned a lot of money for the crew over the years. Killing him wasn't a decision to be made lightly, and it would require approval from the Lucchese family's administration since Hill was well known in mob circles. Before Paul could make that decision, events overtook him. In 1980, Henry Hill was arrested on drug charges. He was looking at serious prison time, and while he sat in jail, Hill made a decision that would change everything. He decided to cooperate with the federal government. Hill's cooperation was devastating. He'd been part of Paul's crew for years. He knew about murders, hijackings, labor racketeering, drug dealing, corruption, everything. He could connect Paul directly to criminal activities that had previously been insulated by layers of subordinates. He could testify from personal knowledge about how Paul's organization operated, about orders Paul had given, about money Paul had received from various criminal enterprises. The FBI couldn't believe their luck. They'd been trying to penetrate Paul Vario's organization for years with limited success. Now they had an insider willing to tell them everything. Hill was debriefed extensively, providing information about crimes spanning more than a decade. Based on his testimony, prosecutors began preparing indictments. Paul learned about Hill's cooperation through his network of informants. The news was catastrophic. In the mob world, becoming an informant was the ultimate betrayal. It violated the most sacred code, Omerta, the vow of silence that every made member and serious associate took. Hill's cooperation meant that he'd signed his own death warrant. If the mob ever found him, he'd be killed. But it also meant that everyone Hill could testify against was in serious jeopardy. The fallout from Henry Hill's cooperation spread through Paul Vario's world like a cancer. Suddenly, operations that had run smoothly for years were compromised. Associates who'd felt secure were now potential defendants. Criminal activities that had seemed untouchable because of Paul's careful insulation were now exposed through Hill's detailed testimony. Paul's immediate concern was damage control. He needed to know exactly what Hill was telling the FBI, what evidence prosecutors were building, who else might be vulnerable. Through his network of corrupt law enforcement contacts, Paul tried to get information about the investigation. But the FBI was being careful this time. They knew Paul had sources inside various agencies, so they compartmentalized information, limiting who knew what about the case they were building. Paul also had to worry about his own crew. When a major member cooperated with authorities, it created paranoia. Who else might flip? Who else might be talking to the FBI? Trust, which was already fragile in the criminal world, became nearly impossible. Paul found himself watching his own people, wondering if any of them were wearing wires or planning to follow Hill's path into witness protection. The Lucchese family's administration was also concerned. Paul had been one of their most reliable earners for decades, but now he'd become a liability. His crew was compromised. His operations were under intense federal scrutiny. The family bosses had to consider whether Paul had become more trouble than he was worth, whether he should be removed from his position or dealt with more permanently. Paul met with Antonio Corallo, who was now the official boss of the Lucchese family. The meeting was tense. Corallo expressed his displeasure with the situation. The Lufthansa heist and its aftermath had brought enormous heat on the family. Hill's cooperation was a disaster. Paul needed to fix this, needed to minimize the damage, needed to ensure that the family's interests were protected. Paul assured Corallo that he could handle the situation. He'd been dealing with law enforcement pressure for decades. He had good lawyers. He knew how to fight charges in court. And he still had loyal people who wouldn't cooperate, who would maintain their silence even under pressure. The organization would survive this, just as it had survived previous challenges. But privately, Paul was worried. Hill knew too much. His testimony could potentially send Paul to prison for the rest of his life. At 65 years old, even a 10-year sentence would effectively be a life sentence. Paul had avoided serious prison time his entire criminal career. The prospect of spending his remaining years in a federal penitentiary was terrifying. The indictments came down in 1980. Paul Vario was charged with multiple counts including extortion, conspiracy, and labor racketeering. The charges were based heavily on Henry Hill's testimony, supplemented by physical evidence and testimony from other witnesses who'd been convinced or coerced into cooperating. The government was building a comprehensive case designed to put Paul away for decades. Paul hired the best criminal defense attorneys his money could buy. They began preparing his defense, looking for weaknesses in the prosecution's case, preparing to attack Henry Hill's credibility. Hill was a drug addict, a criminal, someone who'd committed numerous crimes himself. The defense strategy would be to portray him as a liar who'd say anything to avoid prison time, whose testimony couldn't be trusted. But the prosecution had more than just Hill's testimony. They had wiretap evidence, surveillance records, financial documents that showed unexplained income. They had testimony from other cooperating witnesses. They'd built a case with multiple layers of evidence, designed to withstand challenges to any single witness's credibility. The trial was scheduled for 1984. In the years leading up to it, Paul tried to maintain some semblance of his normal life. He still went to the cab stand, still met with members of his crew who hadn't been indicted or who were fighting their own cases. But everything had changed. The easy confidence of earlier years was gone. Paul was facing the real possibility that he'd spend his final years in prison. His family life suffered. His wife Phyllis was dealing with the stress of the legal proceedings, the media attention, the knowledge that her husband might be going to prison. His children, now adults, had to cope with their father's notoriety. The family name, which had carried respect in certain circles, was now associated with organized crime in the public consciousness. Paul's health was also declining. The stress of the legal proceedings, combined with age, was taking its toll. He had heart problems, high blood pressure, various ailments that came with being in his late 60s. Prison would be especially hard on him physically, something his lawyers would emphasize in court when arguing for leniency. While preparing for his trial, Paul also had to deal with ongoing mob business. He was still a capo in the Lucchese family, still had responsibilities, still had to earn and kick up money to the administration. But his operations were severely compromised. Many of his most reliable associates were either in prison, under indictment, or too scared to participate in criminal activities while under such intense federal scrutiny. The labor racketeering operations that had been so profitable were largely shut down. Companies that had previously paid extortion were now too afraid to continue, knowing that federal investigators were watching. The hijacking operations at the airport were finished. Security had been dramatically increased after the Lufthansa heist, and the workers who'd been facilitating thefts were either arrested or too frightened to continue. Paul's income dropped dramatically. He still had some money saved from years of criminal earnings, but legal fees were expensive, and maintaining his position in the family required continuing to kick up tribute even when he wasn't earning as much. The financial pressure added to the stress of the legal proceedings. In 1984, Paul Vario went to trial. The courtroom proceedings were intense. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically, presenting evidence of Paul's leadership of a criminal organization, his involvement in extortion and labor racketeering, his control over various illegal activities. Henry Hill took the stand and testified for days, describing in detail how Paul's crew operated, what crimes they'd committed, how money flowed through the organization. The defense attacked Hill's credibility relentlessly. They pointed out his drug use, his criminal history, the fact that he was testifying to avoid prison time. They suggested he was exaggerating Paul's role to please prosecutors. They argued that Hill was an unreliable witness whose testimony shouldn't be believed. But Hill's testimony was corroborated by other evidence. Wiretaps caught Paul discussing criminal activities. Financial records showed income from unexplained sources. Other witnesses, some of them former associates who'd also cooperated, confirmed aspects of Hill's testimony. The prosecution's case was strong, built on multiple sources of evidence that reinforced each other. Paul maintained his composure throughout the trial. He dressed well, acted respectfully toward the court, showed no emotion as damaging testimony was presented. He was presenting himself as a legitimate businessman being persecuted by the government, a man who'd been unfairly targeted because of his Italian heritage and his neighborhood connections. The jury didn't buy it. After several weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on most of the charges. Paul Vario, at 70 years old, was convicted of racketeering and extortion. He was facing a substantial prison sentence. The sentencing hearing was Paul's last chance to make his case. His lawyers argued for leniency based on his age and health. They presented character witnesses who testified about Paul's positive qualities, his family responsibilities, his contributions to the community. They argued that sending an elderly man with serious health problems to prison for decades was essentially a death sentence. The prosecutors argued that Paul had been a career criminal who'd profited from violence, intimidation, and corruption for his entire adult life. They pointed out that he'd shown no remorse, had never admitted wrongdoing, had fought every charge. They argued that his age and health shouldn't excuse him from facing consequences for decades of criminal activity. The judge, after hearing arguments from both sides, sentenced Paul Vario to 10 years in federal prison. At 70 years old, with serious health problems, it was likely that Paul would die in prison. The judge acknowledged this in his sentencing remarks, noting that Paul had chosen a life of crime despite having opportunities for legitimate work, and now had to face the consequences of those choices. Paul was taken into federal custody immediately. He was processed into the federal prison system, given a prison number, assigned to a facility. The man who'd run one of the most profitable crews in the Lucchese family for decades was now prisoner number whatever, wearing prison clothes, subject to the orders of guards and prison officials. The adjustment to prison life was difficult for Paul. He was elderly, used to giving orders rather than taking them, accustomed to respect and deference. In prison, he was just another inmate, and an old one at that. The younger prisoners didn't know or care who he'd been on the outside. The guards certainly didn't. Paul's health continued to decline in prison. The prison medical system provided care, but it was basic, minimal, nothing like what he could have accessed on the outside. His heart problems worsened. He developed respiratory issues. He was hospitalized several times for various ailments. His family visited when they could, but it was difficult. The prison was far from New York, requiring long trips that were hard on his elderly wife and demanding for his children who had their own lives and families. The visits were brief, conducted in depressing visiting rooms under the watchful eyes of guards. Paul tried to maintain a brave front, tried to act like he was handling prison okay, but everyone could see the toll it was taking. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Paul's former world was continuing to crumble. The Lucchese family was facing its own legal troubles. Antonio Corallo and other top leaders were facing RICO charges. The family's operations were being dismantled by federal prosecutions. The old system that Paul had been part of for so long was falling apart. Other members of Paul's crew were also facing legal consequences. Some took plea deals and received lighter sentences. Others went to trial and were convicted. Jimmy Burke, Paul's top earner, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Tommy DeSimone had been murdered, killed by other mobsters for reasons that were never entirely clear. The crew that had been so successful and profitable was destroyed. Paul Vario spent his days in prison caught between two worlds. He was physically confined in a federal penitentiary, subject to the routines and indignities of institutional life. But mentally, he remained connected to the mob world he'd known his entire adult life. Other inmates who'd been in organized crime recognized him, treated him with a degree of respect that regular prisoners didn't receive. Even in prison, there was a hierarchy, and Paul's decades as a capo gave him status. But that status meant little in practical terms. He couldn't control anything from inside. He couldn't run operations or manage crews. His power had been based on his ability to organize criminal activities, to reward loyalty and punish betrayal. Locked in a cell, all of that was gone. He was just an old man serving time. His empire reduced to memories and stories he'd tell to inmates who'd listen. The betrayal by Henry Hill continued to gnaw at Paul. In the mob world, cooperation with authorities was the ultimate sin. Hill had violated every principle that Paul had lived by. And the worst part was that Hill was living comfortably in witness protection, given a new identity, protected by the same government that had imprisoned Paul. It was an injustice that Paul couldn't reconcile. Paul thought often about what had gone wrong. Where had he made mistakes? How had he misjudged Hill so badly? He'd trusted Hill, brought him into the crew, given him opportunities. And Hill had repaid that trust by becoming an informant, by testifying, by destroying Paul's life and the lives of many others in the crew. But Paul also understood, in his more reflective moments, that Hill's cooperation was just a symptom of larger changes. The mob world that Paul had known was dying. The old values of omerta, of loyalty unto death, were eroding. Younger criminals didn't have the same commitment to the code. When faced with long prison sentences, more and more mobsters were choosing cooperation over silence. The FBI's use of RICO and other sophisticated investigative techniques had changed the equation. In the old days, prosecutors had to prove specific crimes with direct evidence. Now they could charge people with being part of criminal enterprises and use testimony from multiple cooperating witnesses to build cases. The mob's traditional defenses, intimidating witnesses, maintaining silence, insulating bosses from direct involvement in crimes, were less effective. Paul had been part of organized crime during its golden era, the decades after World War II when the mob had enormous power and influence. He'd seen the families control entire industries, corrupt politicians and law enforcement at the highest levels, operate with near impunity. But that era was ending, killed by federal prosecutions, changing social conditions, and the breakdown of the very codes that had held the mob together. In prison, Paul's health continued to deteriorate. He had multiple heart attacks, each one weakening him further. The prison medical staff did what they could, but their resources were limited. Paul was transferred several times to prison hospitals for treatment, then returned to general population when his condition stabilized. His family continued to visit, though less frequently as years passed. His wife Phyllis was aging too, found the long trips increasingly difficult. His children had their own lives, their own problems. The visits became shorter, more strained. What was there to talk about? Paul's life had shrunk to the confines of the prison. He had no news, no stories worth telling. And his family couldn't share too much about their lives because it just reminded Paul of everything he was missing. In 1986, 2 years into his sentence, Paul received news that Antonio Corallo had been convicted on RICO charges and sentenced to 100 years in prison. Corallo had been the Lucchese family boss, the man Paul had reported to, the leader of the organization Paul had devoted his life to. Now Corallo was in prison too, and at his age, he'd never get out. The Lucchese family's leadership was in chaos. With Corallo imprisoned, control passed to acting bosses who were trying to hold the organization together while under intense federal scrutiny. Many of the family's most capable members were either in prison, under indictment, or dead. The family's criminal operations were severely disrupted. The days when the Lucchese family was one of New York's most powerful crime organizations seemed to be ending. Paul heard all of this through the prison grapevine, through conversations with other mobsters doing time, through occasional messages from people still on the outside. Each piece of news confirmed what he already knew. The world he'd known was gone. Even if he somehow got out of prison, there was nothing to go back to. His crew was destroyed. His operations were shut down. His position in the family was meaningless when the family itself was falling apart. In late 1987, Paul's health took a serious turn for the worse. He had another major heart attack, this one more severe than the previous ones. He was rushed to the prison hospital, where doctors worked to stabilize him. His family was notified that he might not survive. They rushed to the hospital to see him, possibly for the last time. Paul survived that crisis, but barely. His heart was severely damaged. The doctors told him and his family that another major cardiac event would likely be fatal. Paul needed constant medical care, medications, monitoring. The prison medical system wasn't really equipped to provide that level of care for an elderly inmate with serious chronic conditions. Paul's lawyers filed motions for compassionate release, arguing that he was so ill that keeping him in prison was essentially a death sentence, that he should be allowed to spend his remaining time with his family. The prosecutors opposed the motions, arguing that Paul had been sentenced to 10 years and should serve his full sentence regardless of his health problems. The legal battle over Paul's possible release dragged on for months. Meanwhile, his condition continued to decline. He was in and out of the prison hospital regularly. He was on multiple medications. He'd lost significant weight. He looked much older than his 73 years, worn down by stress, illness, and incarceration. In early 1988, the judge who'd sentenced Paul granted compassionate release. Paul would be released from federal custody to spend his remaining time at home with his family. The release was conditional. If he recovered sufficiently, he could potentially be returned to prison to complete his sentence. But everyone understood that wasn't going to happen. Paul was dying. Paul Vario was released from federal prison in May 1988. He'd served approximately 4 years of his 10-year sentence. His family picked him up from the prison and drove him home to Brooklyn, to the house where he'd lived before his incarceration. He was free, but it was a hollow freedom. He was too sick to enjoy it, too weak to do much of anything. The neighborhood had changed during his time in prison. Some of the old faces were gone, dead, in prison, or moved away. The younger generation had different values, different concerns. The mob presence that had once been so visible was now more hidden, more cautious. Law enforcement pressure had driven organized crime deeper underground. Paul spent his days at home, mostly in bed or sitting in a chair, too weak for much activity. His family cared for him. Nurses came to provide medical care. He had medications that needed to be taken on schedule, treatments that had to be administered. It was a medical existence more than a real life. Some old associates came to visit, paying their respects to the old capo. But these visits were awkward. What could they talk about? The old days when things were different. Current mob business that Paul was no longer part of. The conversations were stilted, brief. Everyone was just going through the motions of respect. Paul's mind remained sharp even as his body failed. He thought about his life, about the choices he'd made, about what it had all meant. He devoted himself completely to organized crime, had built a successful criminal career, had earned money and power and respect. And where had it gotten him? He was dying at 73, had spent his final healthy years in prison, had seen his organization destroyed and his closest associates either dead, imprisoned, or turned informant. Had it been worth it? Paul didn't know. He'd lived the only life he'd known how to live, had followed the path that had seemed right for a poor Italian kid from Brooklyn in the 1920s and 30s. But looking back from the end, it was hard to see it as a success. Yes, he'd provided for his family. Yes, he'd achieved power and status in his world. But the cost had been enormous, and in the end, that world had destroyed him just as it destroyed most people who entered it. Paul Vario died on May 3, 1988, just days after his release from prison. He was 73 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but really it was the culmination of years of decline, of stress, of the toll that a lifetime in organized crime had taken on his body and spirit. The funeral was well attended by family and by old associates from the mob world who came to pay their final respects. But it wasn't the kind of funeral that a powerful capo would have received in earlier eras. There was no elaborate display, no huge crowds, no sense of a major figure passing. It was a subdued affair, reflecting the reduced circumstances of both Paul's final years and the organization he'd been part of. Paul was buried in a cemetery in New York, his grave marked with a simple headstone bearing his name and dates. There was no mention of his role in organized crime, no indication of the life he'd actually lived. Just a name and dates like any other person. In the years after Paul's death, his story became more widely known through books and movies. Henry Hill's cooperation had been documented in Nicholas Pileggi's book Wise Guy, which was later adapted into Martin Scorsese's film Goodfellas. Paul Vario appeared in both, thinly disguised under the name Paulie Cicero and portrayed by actor Paul Sorvino. The fictional version of Paul presented in Goodfellas captured some aspects of the real man. His quiet authority, his businesslike approach to crime, his position as a respected capo. But it was still a Hollywood version, simplified and dramatized. The real Paul Vario had been more complex, his life more nuanced than could be captured in a 2-hour movie. Paul's legacy in the mob world was mixed. On one hand, he'd been a successful capo for decades, had run profitable operations, had earned respect from his peers. On the other hand, his crew had produced Henry Hill, whose cooperation had damaged not just Paul but the entire Lucchese family. Some mobsters blamed Paul for not seeing Hill's potential for betrayal, for not eliminating him before he could cooperate. The Lucchese family survived Paul's death and the prosecutions of the 1980s, but in diminished form. New leaders emerged, new operations were established, but the family never regained the power and influence it had possessed during Paul's era. The golden age of the American mafia, the period from the 1950s through the 1970s when organized crime families controlled vast criminal empires, was over. Paul Vario's life story is, in many ways, the story of that era. He rose to power as the mob was consolidating its control over various industries and rackets. He thrived during the decades when organized crime operated with relative impunity. And he fell as federal law enforcement finally developed the tools and determination to seriously damage the mob's operations. His story is also a reminder of the human cost of organized crime. Paul left behind a family that had to live with the shame and consequences of his criminal career. He left behind victims, the people who'd been extorted, the workers whose union welfare funds had been stolen, the families of people who'd been killed by his organization. The prosperity Paul had achieved had come at the expense of others, and that moral debt could never be repaid. In the end, Paul Vario was a criminal who'd chosen a life outside the law and had paid the price for that choice. He'd lived by a code that valued loyalty, respect, and earning money through illegal means. That code had sustained him for decades but ultimately had proven hollow. The loyalty he'd demanded hadn't prevented betrayal. The respect he'd earned had evaporated when his power was gone. And the money he'd made had been consumed by legal fees and had provided no comfort in his final years. Paul Vario's story is not one of redemption or triumph. It's a story of choices and consequences, of a life lived in the shadows that ended in defeat and death. It's a story that should serve as a cautionary tale about the realities of organized crime, stripped of the glamour and romance that popular culture sometimes attaches to it. Paul lived and died in that world, and in the end, that world gave him nothing but regret and ruin.